Alrighty. Well, kia ora koutou, no mai haere mai. Welcome to this week's lockdown special ERI seminar, where we're very delighted to be hearing from Dr. Kiri Wallace and Konny Brown, who are going to be giving us an overview of the Bioheritage Ecoindex program that Kiri co-leads with Dr. John Reid. The Ecoindex program is actually based here at the University of Waikato within the Environmental Research Institute. And Kiri's research interests lie mostly in forest and community ecology, with a special interest in restoration ecology and reconnecting people with nature. And so these expertise have made her an ideal co-leader for the Ecoindex program. Kiri is originally grew up in the USA, where she completed her Bachelor of Science in Animal Science and her Master's in Wildlife Ecology at the University of Delaware. And then she moved here to Hamilton in 2013 to take up a doctoral scholarship, doing her PhD here at the University of Waikato in urban forest restoration ecology. And so she's actually a New Zealander and American dual citizen. Kiri continued on here as a postdoc within the People, Cities and Nature Research Program, and she's now a research fellow within the Environmental Research Institute, where her role is predominantly research-based, but she also contributes to various teaching programs and also supervises postgrad students within the school as well. Kiri has a long list of accolades. She's participated on the editorial board of the journal Ecological Restoration, the Waiwhakariki Restoration Advisory Group, among the Tautiri Science and Technology Advisory Panel, and also the International Eco Health Network, among other things. She's also the current Vice President of the New Zealand Ecological Society. And when she's not busy with all of those amazing things, she also loves to play ultimate frisbee. She likes reading books, which is probably just as well, given we're locked out at the moment. And when we're not having to stay at home, she likes to do a lot of tramping around Aotearoa. So a year ago, we were in this very same situation, hosting ERI seminars via Zoom while the country was in lockdown. And so I'm really pleased that Kiri and Konny were able to talk to us today. And I thank you all for attending from all around Aotearoa today. We'll welcome your questions via either the chat function at the end, or we can unmute our microphones as well once Kiri and Konny have wrapped up their seminar. So Kiri, I'll hand it over to you now to go ahead and give us your talk.
Ngā mihi, Chrissy, and thank you everybody for turning up today. I know that even though we're in lockdown, you could be doing other things besides coming to this seminar over your lunch break. So yes, thanks for that, and kia ora koutou katoa. Whether or not you are a scientist like me, you are getting to participate in an experiment today, which entails taking a biodiversity maniac who's an extrovert and locking them up for a week and then giving them a captive audience. So bear with me as I share with my enthusiasm about the Ecoindex research program. So Chrissy alluded to Konny also helping me to tell this story. I'll kick things off, and then she'll come in for a segment to talk a bit about her specialist work within the program. All right, so a little bit of context first. The Ecoindex research program is hosted within the Bioheritage National Science Challenge, and this is one of 11 national science challenges across Aotearoa. The challenges were established in 2014, so they've been going about 7 years now, and they are all very cross-disciplinary in nature and also mission-led research. So this means that these challenges have been given some science-based wicked problems to approach and solve, and put together teams to do that work. So to do this, the government funding of $680 million was allocated over 10 years to do this, and divided into 2 tranches. So we are in tranche 2 right now of that work. For tranche 2, the Bioheritage Science Challenge created a lot of new initiatives or programs, and the Ecoindex is one of those. So we are a $3.1 million program that runs from 2020, so started last year, to 2024. Okay, so in case you're curious, what are these 11 national science challenges anyway? This gives you an idea, if you have a look at this chart, of what's out there and all the awesome mahi that's going on within the different challenges. You can just have a look at their names and kind of see the broad array of work that's happening. And of course, here's my favorite one that I get to be involved with. This is New Zealand's biological heritage, Ngā Koiora Tuku Iho. Okay, so a little bit about this challenge before I dig into the particular program that I work with. Ngā Koiora Tuku Iho focuses on biodiversity and biosecurity. So some of my favorite things. We're tasked with learning the best ways to protect and manage native biodiversity, our taonga species, and to improve biosecurity, which impacts on that native biodiversity and indeed a lot of our industries and our economy and society at large. So altogether, we are working on enhancing our resilience to harmful organisms. The constituent programs that we have within the Bioheritage Challenge are grounded in values that embrace Te Ao Māori and Mātauranga Māori. So as such, we are clustered into three what we call impacts. We have here in orange, whakamana, empower, impact, tiaki, protect, and whakaho, restore. And where might the Ecoindex sit? Well, right here. So we are in the impact that is focusing on helping New Zealanders protect our precious environment. Before I dig into our particular kaupapa, I'll just mention that the nature of the different science challenges is that they're hosted through different existing institutions around the country. So the Bioheritage Challenge is hosted through Maunaki Whenua Land Care Research. And then the different programs within the different challenges are subcontracted to different institutions again, oftentimes. So the Ecoindex, like Chrissy said, is run through the Environmental Research Institute at the University of Waikato. Now, the challenge, the Bioheritage Challenge has this wonderful array of values that are our foundation for doing our work and working together. So they're shown here in Te Reo, and we don't translate them directly because we want to retain the mana and meaning of those values, but you can have a look at them there and you can see here how we apply them. I love being part of this challenge, especially as an early career researcher, because I feel and I hear from others that it is quite unique in its the nature and the spirit of what it is. In terms of, if you look at these values, they're not always upheld in scientific institutions first and foremost. And so it's really interesting to work in an environment where these are the things that are really valued and cherished and promoted. And it's great to see the openness that that creates amongst the researchers and the teams. And I think the inclusivity and the fairness that it brings. So it's a great foundation, I think, for me anyway. I enjoy working within it to accomplish our big challenges, and it helps me have courage to do that. Now, the Bioheritage Challenge has another very important branch to it called Ngā Takitaki, or Saving Our Iconic Trees. And this is a huge, no pun intended, branch of work that's focused on the trees that are suffering from Kori tieback and myrtle rust. So I want to acknowledge those colleagues who are working in that space, and then differentiate a little bit by just showing that the Ecoindex sits over here within the challenge proper, as it were, but we're all one team within Whakamana. Okay, so who's on my team? I have the privilege of working with a great team. It's been a great bit more than a year so far that we've been working together. Chrissy mentioned my co-lead, John Reed, so he's pictured here. So he's a great partner in crime. We work really well together, and he is based down in Otutahi, Christchurch, partly at the University of Canterbury and partly as an independent consultant. We also have Catherine Kirby pictured here. She's our communication and relationships manager. So it's very likely that you have had some contact with her previously. I hope so. And you may know her from working at the University of Waikato for some time in other research capacities as well. Next to her, we've got Jay. He's our fantastic indicator specialist and environmental economist. And next to him is Konny, who I mentioned you will get to hear from in a little bit later in the seminar. And she works on our data infrastructure and pulling together all the pieces of data that we are orchestrating to accomplish our work. Next to her is Monique, and she's our research assistant. I think of her as she's the glue that holds us together as a team, and I'm grateful for her every day for all of the work she does to keep us all on track and keep us chugging along. Next line here is Nathaniel Calhoun, and he is our strategic and artificial intelligence advisor. He's also good generally with engagement and new technologies, so he's been helpful in advising in those capacities as we kind of further our mahi and explore our pathway and what's the best pathway to take. And then next to him we have Peter Reutemann, who is our data science and infrastructure advisor, and he and Konny work quite closely together to make good decisions for our database platform. And then you'll see we have two more spots here that are undetermined as yet, but there's two more people who we think are going to round out the skill set we need in our team to accomplish our mission. Okay, so what are we all about? The Ecoindex focuses on native biodiversity. So I remember I did say that the Bioheritage Challenge also focuses on biosecurity. There are other programs who do that a little bit more than we do, although it is all kind of interconnected to an extent. And our mandate for our work came about because we have had report after report showing that our native biodiversity and tonga species are declining. And this is unfortunately something that is echoed globally and also is a local problem. And I'm probably preaching to the choir here. I imagine most of you already care about biodiversity and that's why you're here, but you will just be reminded that if we lose our biodiversity as it's declining, this has far-reaching social and economic repercussions. So it's something really that it's not just because we won't have cool things to put into National Geographic magazines anymore, but because it has a lot of other detrimental repercussions on the fabric of how we live. So the other part to this is that we haven't found really effective solutions yet to reverse the decline of biodiversity. And so the Ecoindex is tasked with grappling with that question. Now, when I talk about biodiversity, I just wanted to define that a little tiny bit. It can be quite a big and nebulous concept. You can see here some of the fantastic organisms that we have living here in Aotearoa, and I would call them, some of them are charismatic megafauna. They may not be big, but they're pretty weird and pretty fantastic. And they span a lot of different classes or levels of taxa, if you will, that you can see over here on the right. And I want to also mention that it's not just the different species that are interesting and part of biodiversity, but it's their genetic diversity as well. So within a species, within their population, you can have varying levels of genetic diversity. And if you take it up a level, you can see here all the different types of ecosystems that biodiversity can exist in. So we've got a number of different scales here to think about biodiversity on. And when it comes to these ecosystems or land types, landscape types, we often think about the native bush as being the place where we see all these different creatures, right? And that's good, and we have it safe out there in our parks. But I want us to be thinking more broadly here about biodiversity being in all of these different ecosystems, being beneficial and existing to some extent in all of them, and that we can encourage it to flourish in all of them to the extent that it can. So let's talk a little bit about the objective of this program. We are taking a bit of a different approach here to this gauging of biodiversity and helping it by linking the current investment in biodiversity that we make across the country with the impact on biodiversity. So what do we get from our investment? And let's do this for lots of different land types or ecosystems so we can understand wherever we are, what's the best thing to do. And from linking the investment to the impact, we're hoping that will help us identify the best investment actions for reversing biodiversity decline. So this is really important, right? Because if we can link investment to what it's doing, we can figure out essentially where we can get the most bang for our buck, if you will, because we know that our budgets are all limited and we all are trying to do our best in this arena. So we can find out where are the best actions to take, what are the best actions to take, and where do we need to stop putting in effort because it's not actually doing what we thought. All right, so before we create this Ecoindex, we need to think about where are we going? Why do we even need to create this Ecoindex? What's it being benchmarked against, right? So we tackled this idea of creating a 100-year national biodiversity vision. So a shared vision for those across the country and all the different groups and sectors, and also multi-generational because we are doing this for ourselves and for our children after us and for the legacy that we're leaving, the heritage that we're leaving them. And also because when it comes to nature, you can't rush things. It's taken quite a long time to get to the point where we are with degradation. It's going to take a little while to recover from that. And it's best if we take an incremental approach to that. So that's also why we have this 100-year vision. Here's the vision that we have so far. So this is a working vision and will likely be refined further. But generally speaking, we have summarized it with this phrase, biodiversity corridors restored 2121. So you can see here we have it in Te Reo and we have it in English as well. And part of how we got this vision was a pretty expansive analysis of the different vision statements and biodiversity statements that are out there, that iwi have put out there, scientists have, councils, government, industry. So it's an attempt to capture the vision of a lot of different groups. And we have actually written up that method, that approach or analysis, and it's in a manuscript now that's under review with a journal. So hopefully one day you can read how we did this, and it might be useful to other entities or countries who are interested in creating their own national biodiversity vision. I'll just break down the one for Aotearoa a little bit here so you can get a feeling of where it seems like we think we're going or where we'd like to be. First of all, there'll be thriving, ecologically robust corridors of native land cover that stretch from mountains to the sea. With this point, we're kind of trying to get at this idea of a gradient of ecosystems. So from the mountains all the way down to the sea, and a corridor that's kind of embracing the awa that are flowing in those spaces and encapsulating a lot of different ecosystem types along the way. As it is now, it's often the case that the places where we've restored or conserved ecosystems are more in isolated spaces, and they're not necessarily linked up, and they're not necessarily representative of all the different ecosystem types out there. Secondly, there will be restored corridors that link the conservation estate to private and production landscapes across all catchments. So here we are going on about this idea, or we've come across this idea that, again, let's move away from thinking about biodiversity in the conservation estate and think about it as it can be everywhere. It can be on private land, it can be on farms, it can be on production landscapes. So where it is, let's support it in the best way it can exist there, and let's link it all up. And finally, there will be a minimum of 15% of the original ecosystem or a functioning ecological system extent throughout every catchment, restored, protected, and connected. So this is mostly focusing on this 15% figure, which is supported by science from around the world, showing that below that is quite a risky threshold, because if you drop below that sort of ecosystem extent, it's very difficult for some populations, some species to persist. They go into kind of a tailspin, and over time it's just not sustainable and they will disappear, either locally or entirely. So we don't want that. That's part of the decline that we were trying to get away from. So let's honor this 15%. And if we can, in some cases, let's do better than that if we can. Okay, so now if we have this benchmark or goal, this vision that we want to reach, well, what's step 2 to making that a reality? Let's do it, right? So in order to do it, we need to create the Ecoindex. We need to look at our biodiversity investment and particular indicators and link that to biodiversity impact and indicators in that realm as well, and match those indicators against data that we have out there already. So I'll mention here that this program is not about generating more data or more raw data. We won't be getting out into the Ngāhere and collecting data with clipboards or tablets, even though I like going outside and I'm a little bit sad about that, but that's something that's been a barrier to monitoring biodiversity because it takes so much effort. So what we are doing here is a different approach, kind of harnessing the big data that's out there and telling a story by orchestrating that instead. So a bit of recycling in a way. All right, so I'm going to dig a little bit more into our biodiversity gathering and reporting approach, and it's a little bit more detailed, and it's an expansion on the previous slide. So buckle up, here we go. This is getting into a deep dive. I mentioned our investment big data that we want to harness and pull into our database to make sense of. Here on the left, I'm showing you an array of the organizations that we believe have this sort of data that we will be tapping into. This isn't an exhaustive list, it's not a final list, but it's just giving you an idea of some of the groups we've talked with and that will be hopefully creating these data pipelines too. And then you'll notice here, artificial intelligence, so cool and trendy right now. It is actually a very fun and exciting new technology that we are thinking we'll be drawing on, at least in part, to help us harvest these data or the aspects of the data that we need. So the cool thing about machine learning is that it can help us as we have updated data sets, because the Ecoindex is meant to be a living, breathing entity. So it's not a one-off report. It means we need to keep going back to data sources that keep getting replenished and get a new score over and over again. So anything that can help us handle these huge amounts of data to do that is really great. Now, that big data is going to be matched against these 5 investment indicator dimensions. Now, we've picked these dimensions so far because generally, scientifically or ecologically, we know that they are beneficial for biodiversity when we take these sorts of investments. They're generally quite usable across a lot of different landscapes, so it can help us weave together that national picture. And they're important from iwi perspectives as well. So we may change these indicator dimensions eventually, but for now, the different types of data will be funneled into these different dimensions to help us understand when you push this button or this investment type, what do you get? So that's the next part of this cycle or link, or to me this looks a bit like a hamburger, so sorry, I hope you've eaten your lunch already if you're hungry. So what are the other fillings in our Ecoindex hamburger? Well, the answer is they're the impact side of the equation. So what are we getting when we invest in those indicator dimensions on the left? And here I'm showing you again a list of some of the organizations that house data that we will be hoping to draw upon to gauge the impact. So actually, when we do pest control, how many birds do we get, for example? So what's the reaction there? And again, we're currently exploring what other areas we can pull this impact big data from. And that will be matched against these sorts of impact indicators. So helping us see this full cycle or picture of what we get when we invest in certain areas, so we can know what buttons should we keep pushing and which ones are not actually doing what we thought. Now, at this point, you might be thinking, you guys have a giant puzzle to solve. And we do, you're right. We have a lot of pieces of data to pull together to give us this not only spatially large national picture, but temporally as well, right? Because we don't just want to know how we're doing now, we want to know how were we doing, how are we doing, and where are we aiming for. So the ways in which we might be filling in some of the gaps in our puzzle where there isn't data to draw on is predictive modeling based on the puzzle pieces that we do have that are really good quality data, and extrapolation. So of course we will pull as many puzzle pieces together as we can, and it probably won't look quite like what you're looking at here biodiversity wise, but you know, we'll get there. One of the ways that we're going to, I think, be able to get there is through engagement with a lot of really wonderful other groups. So here's a bit of an indication of some of the groups that we've talked with over the past year or so that we've engaged with, and they have been fantastic in a number of different ways. Some groups have helped us shape our thinking, helped us have a reality check, helped us find where the gaps are, given us feedback on our approach and helped refine it. They have said that they'll contribute data, that they'll test out what we come up with as case studies, and lots of other things too. So we're grateful because we're not on this journey alone. We have a lot of others who are interested in trying out what we're proposing and working together. And you'll see that the color coding here is indicative of different kind of like categories, if you will. So we've got industry, academic institutions, other national science challenges, financial entities who are interested, iwi, government, and NGO and private business. So it seems that the time is ripe for this approach, and there's a lot of interest from a lot of different groups. Okay, so a lot of times when we talk about this with others, there's curiosity about what will this look like in the end. Typically, biodiversity gets reported into some sort of a document or a report, but we're trying to get away from that a little bit and make it a more living thing, not something that's a one-off static piece that gets chucked on a desk or in a filing cabinet, but we want to try to make it something that anybody can access easily, understand quickly, and then check on again. So this might be like a website, right? So we'll get it into the digital realm in an easily accessible format. It may become an app. We'll see how we go and get feedback as we go. But this is a kind of a wireframe example of how the website could potentially look for a national level. So this is showing that it's reflecting that biodiversity investment and biodiversity impact kind of design that I've talked about. So here, for example, we would show this is what we've invested so far as a nation, and here's how we're doing. Here's the impact cumulatively. So score, an Ecoindex score, showing are we in the red zone here? Like this is like the fire danger kind of signal, right? That we're sort of familiar with. Red, not so good. Green, okay, pretty good. But not only do we want to show you, okay, today we're a -2, for example, but we very importantly want to show you how are we trending. So maybe we're a -2, but yesterday or last month, we were a -3. And so this is actually really, really good news because we're reversing that decline. So we're very keen on capturing that sort of change in the rate of decline to tell the good stories, good news stories of what's happening out there for biodiversity. Along with that, we'll also be able to quantify an investment gap. So how much more investment is needed in biodiversity, and how about to reach that vision, that 100-year vision. So for however many years are left, how much money is required to get us to that point, how much more investment, so that we can plan accordingly. And it seems like maybe this is a lot, but I think we all know that over a long time span, broken down, it's actually not all that much, especially for what we get from biodiversity. It's a very worthwhile investment. We want to also break this down by industry. So for example, maybe for sheep and beef, we have a little bit of a dashboard like this so that people working in that space and managing these kinds of production landscapes can be informed what are some of the beneficial actions that they can take. So what's the cumulative investment? What's the impact that they're getting for that? And kind of in what categories and with what sort of responses in what areas that they might be managing for native biodiversity. And this is really important because I think there's a lot of signal out there that people want to look after biodiversity, whatever the type of land that they're managing, to whatever extent they can. And sheep and beef farms have a pretty high proportion of the native vegetation across the country. I think it's something like 23% or something like that. So definitely a really great area to help support the efforts going on there. Then we'll also be breaking this down by region, so different regions can see maybe the actions that are most helpful to take, the investment to take in their region for what they might be managing. And that differs, of course, across the country. And by iwi, by rohi as well. So looking at what's the best action to take in each of these different spaces. Okay, so I'm going to hand over to Konny in just a second here, but I wanted to just zero in a little bit on this one last bit. This has to do with that fire danger arrow. Remember that part, the impact arrow. This is showing here a little bit of how we think we might form that. This flow diagram shows how at point, as we're pulling data in, we'll be breaking it into two scores, the state score and the trend score. And the way I think about this is helping us get a bit of context. The state is, how are we doing today? The trend is, how does that go compared to the rest of like last year, for example? And another way I think about this is this context for scores is like the Olympics. When I was watching the Olympics a few weeks ago, which seems like a few years ago now, I was watching surfing, which is one of our new sports, right? And I was hearing scores, but I didn't know, is that a good score? I don't understand the system. Is that a bad score? Is the surfer good? They seem good. And I couldn't put that into context until I understood the scoring system, or I understood where they sat on the leaderboard. So by reporting both the state of biodiversity and the trend, it's kind of like telling us where we are and putting that into context so it has greater meaning. Okay, so I'm going to hand over to Konny now to go through our data infrastructure a little bit because she's awesome at that. So over to you now, Konny.
Kia ora koutou katoa, ko Konny Brown toko ingoa, and I'm the Data Infrastructure Engineer on the Ecoindex program. I'm here to talk today about the data flow and structure for the Ecoindex. Next slide, please, Kiri. Awesome. So to begin with, I'll just go over the overall data flow for the program. So on the left here, you see labeled APIs and pulled datasets. APIs here represent the application programming interface, or basically the software layer that we would be interacting with external databases in order to gather data from them. The pulled datasets section represents scraped data or downloaded data that we weren't able to gain through the API interface. So that would be something like Excel sheets or CSV files, whatever people can hand over in a different format. So both of these will feed into a raw data storage before going through a process called ETL. Now, ETL is a very common term in data engineering. It just basically means extracting the data, which is kind of already represented here on the left side, transforming the data so it's in the correct shape, and then loading that data into the database. And here we have two databases that we're envisioning that we will create. There is one for the impact indicators and another for investment indicators, and both feed into a unified reporting platform and can be used for further data analysis and modeling. Next slide, please. Okay, so how does this actually look in detail? So just to go over the impact data flow as an example, here on the left we have the raw data represented by birth surveys 2001 to 2011, which is then transformed and loaded into an intermediate schema. Now, schema here just means a database structure or model, which are all held physically, perhaps in the same database, but are kept separate in terms of data. So this intermediate schema would have a similar measure. So for example, species count, and would represent one facet of biodiversity. So in this case, bird biodiversity. This is then used to calculate the state and then loaded into a final schema on the right here. Now, a couple of things to note. This intermediate schema pathway isn't really going to take place when it comes to the investment data, because the measure is the same across all investment, where it's dollar values. And the other thing to note is that this step of calculating state and loading into the final schema, at a later point, you could change the calculation and reload that, as the intermediate schemas and all of the raw data will still be kept. Next slide, please. Now, how does this look in a little bit further detail? So if we have this bird biodiversity schema on the left here, which is the intermediate schema. This intermediate schema will then be used to develop a standardization function, which is then used to calculate the state. And this state would be an aggregated state. So for example, if you go back to the bird biodiversity example, it will be all of the species counts of different species aggregated into a single state that represents the bird biodiversity health. This is then loaded per time unit and location into a final schema. Next slide, please. So before I go further into the database structure, I'll talk a little bit about a concept called data warehousing, which is commonly used in business intelligence, which is basically used by businesses to aggregate their data and query it in order to make better business decisions. So on the left here is what we classically think of when we think of databases. It's an online transactional processing database. And this database is used for processing transactions. So it's optimized for doing those inputs, outputs, changing, and as well as deleting data. So what you might be concerned with, for example, might be who bought X. On the right here is an online analytical processing database. Now this is optimized for processing data queries for analytics and reporting rather than for transactions. So you might be concerned with how many people bought X. And this is the kind of database that we're interested in creating. Next slide, please. So a very common schema design that is used in data warehousing is a star schema. The basic design involves a centralized fact table in the middle that has a many-to-one relationship with different dimensions. Now the fact usually represents a measurement or a metric or a unit that's being measured. And then the dimension represents a category or dimension of that fact table. So to illustrate this better, next slide please, Kiri. If you look at this graph here, and you look at the x-axis, you can see representing dimension, different months as the category, which is summarizing the y-axis, which is the fact, otherwise known as sales and thousands. Next slide, please. Now, how would this look like for our Ecoindex? So for the investment side of things, the schema would be relatively simple. The fact table in the middle would represent amount values or in dollar values, which is the metric that we're measuring, and then would have dimensions of type, which could be investment of trap purchase, going into investment type of predator control, location, which would have coordinates, catchment, rawhai, and region, which would be hierarchical, which means that if you input data at a coordinates level, it would automatically populate the catchment, rawhai, and region based on those geospatial coordinates. And then finally, time, which similarly would be hierarchical as well. So if you put in a date, it would automatically populate the month and year. That kind of allows us to input data that has different dimension levels. So you could have data that is at a monthly level and still take that into account at the yearly level. Next slide, please. So on the impact side of things, it's a little bit more complicated because of that intermediate schema that I mentioned before. So on the left, we have a visual representation going back to that bird biodiversity example of the intermediate schema there. So the fact that you're measuring would be count in this case. The type could be species, genera, whether indigenous or not. And the location and time dimensions will actually be the same as investment. And on the right side here, you can see the aggregated state fact table. So this is after loaded into a final schema. And the state here would represent that aggregated state, as I mentioned. Type here would represent what biodiversity schema that it came from. So in this case, it would be bird. And then location and time is again the same. Now those dimensions are the same because they allow the data modeler or subsequent data analysis to pull that investment data and the impact schema together on those dimensions. So that way you can link what the biodiversity is like at a certain time and area to what the investment was in that time and area. Now that's all I have on the data infrastructure side of things. I'll hand back to you, Kiri. Thanks very much.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Konny. That's really helpful. And so we'll have some questions after this. And so if you have questions specific to that stuff, Konny is sticking around and can tackle those. But I'll do a little wrap up here first, which is just what's next for us, right? So now you've seen kind of where we are. Well, where are we going? Right, so like any good big project or program, we've broken it down into steps. And so for project A, we are going to be trialing remote sensing and artificial intelligence to gauge native vegetation land cover. This is one of our more cutting edge projects within the program. To use this remote sensing, such as like satellite imagery, for example, and then machine learning in tandem is a way at getting at a really large scale chunk of data, so native vegetation and all the changes it undergoes across the entire country. So that'll be fun and interesting to see if we can get that trained, that machine learning trained, to be able to give us some good answers about how that's changing every time we have an inflow of new remote sensing imagery of any type. Project B is generally what Konny was just talking about. So that's the core of our MAHI. This is taking those biodiversity data sets that are out there and plugging them in all together to determine that state of native biodiversity. Project C is the next step to look at levels. So what kind of investment and types, so intensity of investment that's required to ecologically restore and maintain our native land cover and the biodiversity that it holds. So noting here that native land cover is, we're thinking of it as sort of a proxy for biodiversity, but we know it's not, they're not equivalent to any extent at all, but it's a way of helping us get at an important trophic level of biodiversity. And so for this one, for Project C, we need to be modeling that link between the investment that we're making and what difference it's making. So it might be something that we find out, oh, look, landscape connectivity is by far the best button to push to get more invertebrates, for example, more pipit tuna or puteri moths. We don't know the answer yet. That's not something we've calculated, but that's the sort of thing we would like to be able to answer, and breaking that down into different regions or industries, etc., like I outlined before. And then finally, once we've done that, we are going to be able to establish clearer baselines and refine that 100-year national biodiversity vision, so we can get more specific land cover targets, what kinds of ecosystems where, what kinds of investments in those ecosystems will get us what we want for biodiversity. And these are all parts of a whole, right? So they're designed to dovetail together as projects to get us a prototype. So next year, we hope to report back with our very first Ecoindex score to help us understand what's going on out there. And of course, there's going to be some refinement to do after that, right? It's just our first go at this. So it may be that we need to do things like refine indicators. Again, after that, we find some of them are actually not as helpful as we thought. There's other ones that are great indicators of how biodiversity is doing. We may find new biodiversity data sets to work with. And then with what we come up with, we want to work with land managers and see, is what we're providing actually helpful, and where can we help them generate useful actions to reverse the decline of biodiversity. Ultimately, we're not looking to generate a bunch of information. We're looking to generate information that's useful. So we need to road test this and see if it's helpful and people can use it. So I'm going to leave it there and we can tackle some questions. Namihi for listening, and I hope that you enjoyed that and are as excited as we are about this adventure.
Sure, everyone's clapping for you, Kiri. Thank you, that was wonderful. Thanks, Konny, as well. Okay, oh good, you've taken off your screen share. I'm just going to pop this on gallery view so I can see everyone. I think there's already a bunch of questions in the chat. Would you like me to read them, or are you happy to have a go with some of those first?
I'll just have a quick look and see what we've got here. Yes, so this one's more of a comment, I think. Yes, but very helpful. So thinking about native planting and where does forestry sit in that picture in terms of impacts for biodiversity. So I think hopefully I've got that one right. That's from Andrew Sinclair. You're welcome to unmute and clarify. So thinking about that aspect of biodiversity as well. Yeah, that native forestry definitely houses some native biodiversity, especially in the understory there. So we need to be aware that that's part of the equation. I agree. I'll just keep having a look here. Okay, Paul asked about, yeah, the indicators relating to national, regional, and rohe scales, but can these go down to catchment and even property scales? Yes, well, that's a good question, and we've been wrestling with it. We would like to get down to the catchment scale. We are not aiming to get down to property scale because of respecting privacy. So, you know, we're not out there to be policing people's biodiversity work, even remotely on individual farms or individual properties. It's very much about keeping this data somewhat anonymous and protecting people, but giving helpful information about what actions that they can take on their land, if that kind of makes sense. So the catchment's probably as fine scale as we can get, or that we want to get at this point anyway. Sophie, hi. You asked, is the project focused on terrestrial habitats, or are you going to hope to include freshwater and marine? Yeah, good question. So we are focusing on terrestrial and freshwater, but not marine. That's more in the sustainable seas kind of remit. It's a different national science challenge. It's a bit funny because, of course, all these ecosystems are intertwined and it's hard to pull them apart and work on them separately. But that's kind of the way we're approaching it. So yeah, we're more focused on that terrestrial and the freshwater side of things. Kevin asks, would you be interested in finding champions for the cause? Yes, definitely. We're always up to having champions for the cause. We'd have to talk more about what specifically that would entail. We have some fantastic leadership and specialists within the challenge already who champion our work and who engage with external parties. But yeah, the more the merrier. I think we're definitely a very collaborative kind of group. We want to work together and be transparent about what we're doing. Thanks for the enthusiasm, Jenny. That's cool. You like the broad scale landscape connectivity and collaborative focus. So let's see. Yes, so the gaps, you're saying, yep, we have a lot of gaps in our knowledge of species and biodiversity. This is extremely true, and this was outlined pretty clearly in the PCE report that came out in November 2019, that we have a very patchy landscape when it comes to biodiversity data. So of course we can do more and do better if we can fill in some of those gaps. What we are thinking is we hopefully can help pinpoint where some of the most crucial gaps are for future biodiversity monitoring investment, what kind of maybe investment needs to be made to fill those gaps. In the meantime, we'll be taking what we do have already and orchestrating that the best we can to tell this story. So kind of a twofold outcome, I guess, in a way there. Hopefully the Ecoindex can be improved with time as more of the gaps get filled up and we have more puzzle pieces to work with. And that will give us a better score in a lot of ways, yep. Let's see. So Dan asked, are other countries doing something similar? These are great questions, everyone. We haven't come across anything else quite like this anywhere else in the world, which is fun and exciting, but also it means that we have to do a lot of the exploration on our own. So I'd love to know about it. If anybody knows about another similar program, you know, look us up and let us know about that so we can work together or learn from each other. But in the meantime, hopefully we're on the right track, right? And we're just being good old innovative Kiwis, trying out something new and interesting. Let's see, what have we got here? So, oh, very cool question from Fraser. Monitoring impact of monetary investment makes a lot of sense. Is there also a plan for tracking and quantifying legislative impact? Yes, well, there is no specific plan for that, but it's something that we've talked about quite a bit and that we would like to be able to gauge. But of course, you know, this is a thing that can mushroom so easily, like let's measure that, let's measure that, let's measure that. And, you know, so we're trying to stick with our core mandate to answer that question about biodiversity decline and how to effectively stop it or reverse it. But if we can build in any sort of how does this impact legislation, then that would be something we'd like to do as well, to see if that gets into legislation and then trickles down. So it has a bit of a top-down approach. We would certainly hope so. And as a government-funded, we're an MB-funded program, that would be smart, right? So let's hope so. And we actually, I should mention, have other programs within the Bioheritage Science Challenge who are focused almost solely on legislation and championing biodiversity and biosecurity in the legislative space. So we can work hand in hand with them too. So what we would do is say, hey, here's what we found. How does that apply? How do you guys see that? Working that into the legislative framework and kind of recommending that to be passed along. Chrissy just stopped me if we're running out of time. There's still a lot more questions, which is great.
Yeah, I think we're good for at least a couple more.
Okay, great. Let's see here what else we've got.
You're up to Laura.
Okay. Hello, Laura. Yes, okay, so regarding data that will need to be scraped rather than accessed via API. Ooh, this could be a Konny one. Konny, have you seen this one? Will you be looking at creating an accessible repository for this so it is centrally available for uses other than the Ecoindex program? Yeah, Konny, if you feel like tackling this one, I'll hand it to you.
So we're definitely going to be creating a front-end API for people to plug into our database. We will have to take some care in terms of considering multi-data sovereignty as part of that, as well as privacy if we do end up using any data from land managers directly. So once we've kind of gone over the niggly details of that and we have everything sorted, yeah, there should be a front-end API that's available to use.
We are trying to keep things as, I hope I'm using the right terms here, the tech stuff as open source as possible, open access. That's definitely part of the goal. This isn't like something we want to wrap up or let get privatized in any way. This is public investment for public good, for good. So keeping it that way. Let's see. Cheryl asked, do you have an idea on when this index might be at a stage where catchment managers may be able to trial this resource? Seems like it has lots of potential for informing management decisions. We hope so. That's definitely the way it's been designed to help people manage their budgets and their allocation of resources. It may be that the prototype next year is helpful for catchment managers. It's possible it will be only in certain places because we're working with particular case studies in particular regions to start with to kind of get things going and work through bugs and the hiccups that are inevitably going to come up. So it may not be for everyone everywhere that soon, but hopefully that will expand in the years following next year. So I guess it's a watch this space. And on that note, we send out regular email updates, so you can sign up for those if you want by emailing our manager, our communication manager. I'm trying to see if that's actually on our slide, which you can't see anyway, but it's not on there. But you can look us up on Facebook or on Twitter and connect that way if you want, and get in the loop with what we're up to.
You want to take the last question maybe, Kiri? And then
Okay.
What I might do as well is download the chat for you, because I think people are putting a few links and things that might be useful, so I can send that to you.
Yeah, that would be great. Thank you, everyone. Great engagement. I was really looking for your responses. I wanted to know, what do you think of this, and how can we make it even better? I'm actually trying to look for...
There's a lot.
So, I know, I'm like, whoa.
I think the next one was from Andrew asking, is there a connection with 1 billion trees?
Yep. Okay, so we have been thinking about that. We haven't actually enacted any sort of direct connection. What we'd be looking for, I think, from that is any sort of accumulated data tracking where there have been plantings, right? So that can go into the native planting dimension. So we need to probably have some correro around that, about if there's data accessible in one space that we can kind of plug into and make part of the Ecoindex score ultimately. So yeah, if you are a 1 billion trees person who's listening to this and you're excited by that, get in touch, because we have had you on our radar, but we just haven't gotten there yet.
Great. Well, as much as there's still loads and loads of more messages coming through, I will close it there just to allow everyone to go off and to other meetings. But thank you so much, Kiri, and also to Konny for that amazing tour of the Ecoindex program. It's really fascinating. And thank you to everyone for joining and your engagement. This has been a really fabulous ERI session. And you're all very welcome to come to our next one in a fortnight's time as well. Thank you.